Okay, so picking up where we left off earlier with chapter 4, we were talking in class about how when we notice other cultures, is it that everybody's different, or how does it work out with behavior? And one of the things that we said was so that we kind of notice outliers. And is it that for this particular side, is it that all French people are arrogant and snooty? The answer to the question has to do with probability and statistics that you guys have already taken. And there's a couple different ways we can look at how people are different, or values, as we're going to call it. Uh, Remember from your statistics class, you had the normal curves here, and there's a lot of overlap between how French behave and how people from the United States behave here, marked in the blue. In fact, most of it is overlap when we see it. But a different way to think about these exact same curves, if you'll watch, that's the exact same curve that we just saw, was that people at the extreme end, what you see is many, many more French people relative to Americans who are arrogant or flamboyant or emotional. And so, is it that all French people are arrogant or flamboyant or emotional? No, that's not the case at all. In fact, most of them are kind of normal and not that much different than the average American. But when we get to the outliers, the really arrogant people or the really emotional people, we see French are a lot more than Americans. So that's the outliers. And then how do the French view us? Well, they see us as aggressive and workaholics and unprincipled. Well, when the fact is, it's not, most of us aren't like that. It's just compared to the French, who are aggressive and workaholics and unprincipled, there's a lot more Americans, 5 or 6 times as many at the tail end of your curve. So that's another way to really think about what these differences are that we've been talking about. And so I want us to think about that as far as what are values. And values are driven from culture, and they're what you learn as you grow up about the important things, the basic right or wrong, good and bad things. And so culture influences what your values are. And as I stated earlier in class, where you grew up is going to determine what kind of values you have. If you grew up in Louisiana and you had been adopted, given up for adoption and been adopted, and a Chinese family, let's just do a thought experiment, had adopted you, your values would be a lot different when it came to things like democracy and uh, what you thought was right or wrong, and capitalism and freedom and individualism. All of those things would be very different. So your values are driven in a large part by culture. And so we want to get into this discussion, and this is where we really get into the kind of business and management aspect. How do we think about those values, and how they're important for different types of businesses? Well, a guy came along 30 or 40 years ago, Gert Hofstede, who made this a lot easier for us. He worked at IBM, and he said, I want to look at the values that are really important to business and how they vary across cultures. What's the most important ones that vary across cultures? And he came up with 4 dimensions that we talked about in class and that I want to go over here real quick: power distance, uncertainty avoidance, individualism and collectivism, and then masculinity, femininity. And so power distance is essentially how cultures are okay with power when it's distributed unequally. In low power distance countries like Austria or Finland or Ireland, people are not okay when power is distributed unequally. They like for people to be generally equal to each other. They like for organizations to be flatter. Um, Supervisors and bosses are referred to as on a first name basis. That's not how it is in high power distance countries such as South Korea. And we talked about Koreans and how they defer to authority figures. Mexico or India, in these sorts of countries, people readily accept unequal power differences. So if you're a boss, you're way, way higher than what you would be in a country with a low power distance. You're sort of seen as a godlike figure if you're a CEO or a president or royalty. And so these high power distance countries have tall structures and people blindly obey superiors. And this really, really matters for management. This really matters for business because this power distance drives a lot of the behavior that people have at work, whether it's high or low. Hofstede also found that uncertainty avoidance was a value that's really important for us to understand. Essentially, uncertainty avoidance is how okay you are with ambiguous situations. If you have low uncertainty avoidance, like Denmark or Great Britain or the United States is in that category, then you're okay with unknowns. You're okay with not knowing the answer. You're okay with being in a gray area, not in a black or white area. Well, cultures that have high uncertainty avoidance do not like those unknowns. They want security, they want written rules, they want experts to help them if they get in these uncertain situations, and people just avoid uncertainty. And so that really changes whether you're low uncertainty or high uncertainty. It really changes how you react in the workplace and what your behaviors and decision making processes are. Hofstede found a third dimension here, which was individualism and collectivism. And we talked about this quite a bit in the class. But the way he sort of said was that individualism countries are kind of the ones that focus on personal initiative, tend to have Protestant backgrounds, and tend to make decisions based on markets. These are obviously the United States and our neighbor Canada and many other countries, kind of in Western, Northern Europe. And then you have high collectivism countries. Those are the poorer countries where there's not this Protestant work ethic. And the Protestant work ethic is that working really hard and being successful and making a lot of money gets you into heaven. These countries like Indonesia, Pakistan, many other countries that are collectivists, they don't have this view that success is the key to life. It's a lot different. So promotions in these countries tend to be based on experience and seniority. It's not how good you are. The idea of paying a young person who's really talented a lot of money is crazy in these high collectivism countries. In our country, it's not. If you're talented, then you deserve a lot of money. And then Hofstede's fourth dimension was masculinity and femininity. And it doesn't quite mean what those words masculine and femininity mean right off the top of your heads. What he said was that countries differ in the amount that they stress power, status, wealth, job stress, earnings, those sorts of things. And masculine countries like Germany, Japan would fit into here, United States would fit more into here, where getting promotions, having a really good job that pays really well is seen as a good thing. In other countries, that's not. If you're really stressed about your job, and you're, talking about it at parties and at dinner and stuff like that, people are like, "What's wrong with you?" That's not the point. In feminine countries, the point is to have a friendly atmosphere at work and to have a relaxing and a high quality of life and to have employment security, to not be worried about that you're going to get fired. In these high masculine countries, people are really worried about getting fired all the time. Right? So those were Hofstede's cultural dimensions, and they really made an influence on the way that people think about cultural values in the workplace. Okay, and then a few years later, after that, a professor named Trompenaar came along, and he said, "Well, there's some more values that we need to consider that are also important." So I kind of want to go over those real quick. So Trompenaar came up with this idea of universalism versus particularism, and essentially what he said was that in high universalism countries, people follow rules no matter if the situation changes or not. The United States is like that. If you sign a contract, you are held to what's written on that contract. Courts don't go in and change it because someone got a really good deal when they signed a contract. That's not how it works. Well, in particularistic countries, that's actually how it works. If you sign a contract and you got the better end of the deal over time and it shows that you got a real advantage with your deal, uh, people will tear up that contract and they'll go back and start over because contracts depend on the situation. That both parties need to be equal in the contract. So it's really hard for us to imagine a situation like that in the United States, but it happens all the time. Where in other countries, where you take your case to the court and they say, well, one person got too much of advantage, we're going to go and redo this contract or redo what's owed. It's really unthinkable in the United States. Um, Schopenhauer also had individualism and communitarianism, which is, again, a big overlap with what Hofstede had with his individualism and collectivism. So I won't get into that too much, but just to know that it's really individuals versus groups about what's important as far as what Schopenhauer goes. Schopenhauer also talked about neutral versus emotional countries. And so I'm going to talk about this in class, but a neutral culture is when it's really bad to show emotions. So to laugh, pat someone on the back, to be loud at a party, that's not a cool thing. That shows that you don't have control over your behavior. And it shows that you're a weak person or a dumb person. And so cultures differ in the amount of emotions that it's okay to show. In emotional cultures, if you don't laugh, if you don't act happy, if you don't smile, if you don't move around a lot and show expressiveness, then you're the weird one. So in high emotion cultures, people smile, they talk loudly, they greet each other with enthusiasm. It's a much different type of culture than ones where people act stoically, like in Japan or China or even United Kingdom. Specific and diffuse cultures. This one's not very straightforward, so I want to make sure I explain it right. Specific and diffuse is about how much private versus public space that people have. So in specific cultures like the United States or like United Kingdom or like Austria, people have a very large public space, but then their private space that they have, their home life or their personal life, is very small, but they guard it very closely, and they don't let other people see what happens with their personal life, and they're even treated differently at home. So, for instance, people don't call me when I'm with my friends or with loved ones. They don't call me Professor Whitman. They call me by my first name or some nickname that they might have. That's not how it is in a diffuse culture. In a diffuse culture, your public and your private life are the exact same. So in a country like Venezuela or China or Spain, a partner or my wife may call me Professor Whitman, which is a really weird thing for us to think about, is that what we do in our public life is basically the same as our private life. They're not guarded. People have very closely linked personal and private lives, which is not how it is in the United States. Those are two very different things. Achievement versus ascription cultures. This is something Schopenhauer found, and he found that basically there's two extremes for how people view status. In achievement cultures like the United States, people view status on merit, on how well you perform something, on what your skills are like. That's not how a lot of cultures, like ascription cultures, do. They base status on who you are basically at birth, what kind of person you are, what kind of family you were born into. So in Venezuela, it would be, how rich your family was or what their name was. These names mean a lot in Latin American countries. In China, it would be how closely you're associated with the Communist Party. So if you're heavily involved in the Communist Party, then your children are going to have huge advantages. Doesn't matter if they're good or bad. That's ascription. Schopenhauer also talked about time and how people think about time. And this is pretty interesting here. Um, there's certain cultures where people do one thing at a time. And then there's other, like the United States, we do one thing at a time. You do something at 4 o'clock, then you do something at 4:30, and then you do something at 5. And we have it scheduled like that. In synchronous cultures, we have very different kind of a viewpoint about time. So, for instance, in France or Mexico, people are doing multiple things at different times. And if they were supposed to be at a meeting and they're having a meeting already, they're not going to cancel it. They're going to continue having that meeting if everything's going really well, if they have a chance to make a sale or a chance to form a relationship. And so they might be really late or cancel an appointment at the last minute. And the people they're canceling with or that they're late with understand that because things are very fluid. There's a synchronous kind of a component to the multiple things that are happening. That's not how it is in the United States. We follow plans from start to finish. And if you have an appointment at 5 o'clock, at 4:45, you're going to tell the person that you're with, hey, I have an appointment at 5. And it doesn't matter who it's with, they'll understand. And then finally, what Trump and R found about how we view ourselves kind of within the environment, if you can kind of think of it that way. Certain cultures believe they're in control of the environment, and other cultures believe that things just are taking their own course. You can't really control what's happening in this life. So China and many Asian countries are kind of like that. For as hardworking as those cultures are, they're very much believers in fate. That's obviously not the United States. In the United States, we believe that there's kind of this this American dream that if you work hard and go after your goal, then you can make of your life what you want to make of it. It's a very popular kind of belief, and that doesn't really exist the same way in Asian cultures.